My mother destroyed my house at 3 in the morning during a psychotic break, accusing me of being an impostor. And when I had her forcibly committed, she whispered through the sedation that I had betrayed her. The deafening sound of glass exploding against the concrete wall of my living room violently tore me from deep sleep at 3:17 in the morning on a freezing Tuesday in June, when the cutting cold of winter transformed the early morning hours into periods of absolute silence that amplified any unexpected sound in a frightening and disproportionately threatening way. I jumped out of bed with my heart racing as if I had just woken up in the middle of a violent robbery, my bare feet touching the cold wooden floor while my brain still tried to process whether this was reality or just another of the recurring nightmares that had been tormenting me in recent weeks since I noticed the gradual but undeniable changes in my mother's behavior. The sound of more objects being hurled with brutal force echoed through the two-story house I had bought with so much effort 3 years before, each crash making my stomach contract in spasms of panic as I ran barefoot through the dark hallway toward the origin of that destruction that seemed methodical and intentional rather than accidental. When I finally reached the living room, breathless and terrified, the scene I found before my eyes seemed to have come directly from a psychological horror film. My mother, Margaret, a woman who for 62 years had been synonymous with discreet elegance and calculated emotional restraint, was standing barefoot in the middle of a sea of glass shards that glittered like deadly diamonds under the faint moonlight coming through the open windows. Holding in her trembling arms my antique Chinese porcelain vase that had cost 3 entire paychecks and that I kept as a family heirloom inherited from my maternal grandmother. Her graying hair, normally impeccably styled in soft waves, was completely disheveled, falling in irregular strands over her pale face that displayed a terrifying expression of fury mixed with deep confusion, as if she were simultaneously conscious and unconscious of her own destructive actions. Her blue eyes, which I had always associated with maternal affection and wisdom acquired through decades of life experiences, now seemed completely empty of recognition, staring fixedly at some invisible point above my head, while her lips moved rapidly, murmuring incomprehensible words that seemed like accusations directed at people who weren't present in the room. The beige cotton nightgown she wore was torn at the left shoulder, revealing a superficial but bloody scratch that she apparently didn't notice or simply didn't care to acknowledge the physical pain she should be feeling. My feet froze instantly at the threshold of the room when I realized that any sudden movement on my part could trigger an even more violent reaction from this woman I didn't recognize as the loving mother who had raised me with infinite patience and absolute dedication during 3 decades of maternal relationship that I had always considered unshakable and permanent. "Mom, please listen to me. You're scaring me so much, I need you to put that vase on the floor carefully and explain to me what's happening," I managed to articulate with a trembling voice that came from my throat constricted by growing anxiety and paralyzing fear that any wrong word could transform this already dangerous situation into irreversible tragedy. Margaret slowly turned her head in my direction with robotic movements that seemed to require tremendous conscious effort, and when her eyes finally focused on my face, I found no trace of maternal recognition or family affection that should naturally exist after 37 years of intimate daily cohabitation and unbreakable blood ties. "You're not really my daughter. You're an imposter they sent here to spy on me and steal my most important secrets. But I discovered your plan, and now I'm going to destroy all the hidden cameras you installed in my personal belongings," she declared with absolute and terrifying conviction, her voice carrying that peculiar quality of people who completely believe in delusions that have no basis whatsoever in the reality shared by the rest of humanity. Each word that came out of her mouth was like a knife stabbing directly into my maternal heart, not just because of the absurd accusation itself, but mainly because it revealed that the brilliant and lucid mind I had always admired had been invaded by paranoid thoughts completely disconnected from our real and authentic family history. During the following 20 minutes that seemed to drag on for interminable hours of unbearable psychological tension, I tried every communication strategy I could desperately invent to calm Margaret and make her drop that precious vase before she destroyed it, or seriously hurt herself with the sharp shards that already covered the entire living room floor. I tried appealing to specific memories of our shared history, mentioning detailed family trips we had taken together, memorable birthdays we had celebrated with cake and colorful candles, intimate conversations about romantic relationships that only we two knew because they were confidences whispered on sleepless nights when I needed wise maternal advice. But each attempt of mine to reactivate her emotional memory and family reconnection was met with more paranoia and increasingly elaborate and complex accusations about imaginary conspiracies involving neighbors, distant relatives, and even public officials who supposedly had united in a secret plot to destroy her life through constant electronic surveillance and systematic psychological manipulation. Mom, remember when you took me to buy my first architecture book when I was 16? You held my hand in the bookstore and said I would be a brilliant professional because I had genuine passion for creating beautiful and functional spaces. I tried to appeal to a particularly emotional memory that had always connected us deeply, but Margaret only laughed in a strange and mechanical way that possessed no trace of genuine humor or recognizable maternal affection. When I finally realized that rational argumentation or emotional appeals would have no effect whatsoever on this completely altered version of my mother, I grabbed my smartphone with violently trembling fingers and dialed the medical emergency number that I never imagined I would need to use for my own nuclear family. I need an ambulance urgently at my address. My mother is having some kind of severe psychotic break. She's destroying my entire house and doesn't recognize me as her daughter, believes in delusional conspiracies, and could seriously hurt herself at any moment. I explained rapidly to the trained operator, who responded with calm professional voice that contrasted dramatically with the absolute chaos I was experiencing. Ma'am, can you leave the residence safely while waiting for the ambulance? Are you in immediate physical danger? Asked the operator, following established protocols for domestic psychiatric emergency situations. I looked at Margaret, who had now begun methodically tearing the curtains from the living room windows while murmuring accusations about listening devices hidden in the fabric seams. And I felt a devastating mixture of fear for my physical safety and unbearable emotional pain at witnessing the mental disintegration of the woman who had given birth to me and raised me with so much love and dedication during decades of exemplary motherhood. The ambulance arrived exactly 19 minutes after my desperate call, preceded by strident sirens that cut through the frozen silence of the suburban dawn and awakened curious neighbors who turned on lights in their windows to discreetly observe the drama unfolding in the house that had always been a symbol of family stability and respectable bourgeois normalcy. 2 uniformed paramedics quickly descended from the white vehicle with red crosses painted on the sides, carrying medical equipment and mainly displaying that neutral professional expression of people trained to handle severe psychiatric emergencies without showing moral judgment or emotional shock in the face of bizarre and destructive behaviors. Ma'am, I'm paramedic Luis and this is my colleague Carla. We're going to enter the residence to assess your mother's situation and provide appropriate medical care, said the tall man of approximately 40 years, consulting a clipboard with information that the emergency center had relayed about the call. I led them through the front door to the devastated living room where Margaret was now sitting on the torn sofa, hugging pillows as if they were babies needing urgent maternal protection, rocking her body back and forth in a repetitive and hypnotic movement that characterizes severe dissociative states, where the person progressively loses contact with shared external reality. My mother has never had a history of psychiatric problems. She's always been an extremely lucid and functional woman. But in the last 3 weeks, I started noticing gradual changes in her behavior. Unusual forgetfulness of important appointments, vague accusations about people supposedly following her through the streets, chronic insomnia that made her walk through the house during entire early mornings. I explained rapidly to the paramedics while they cautiously approached Margaret with calculated movements, so as not to frighten her and trigger additional violent reactions. Paramedic Carla, a brown-skinned woman of medium height with hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, slowly knelt in front of Margaret and began speaking with a soft and non-threatening voice, trying to establish some kind of emotional connection that would allow basic medical examination without use of forced physical restraint. Mrs. Margaret, my name is Carla, and I'm here to help you. I can see you're going through a very difficult and confusing time, but I need to check your blood pressure and temperature to make sure you're physically well, she said, slowly extending her empty hands to demonstrate that she represented no immediate physical threat. Margaret looked at the paramedic with deep distrust stamped on every line of her wrinkled face, her faded blue eyes meticulously examining the uniform, the medical equipment, searching for evidence that would confirm her delusional theories about elaborate conspiracies against her person. The process of convincing Margaret to accept medical care and mainly to voluntarily enter the ambulance for transport to the nearest psychiatric hospital took almost an entire hour of careful negotiations that tested absolutely all my emotional patience and psychological resistance already severely compromised by the traumatic night. During this interminable period, the paramedics demonstrated impressive professional skill in dealing with resistant psychiatric patients, alternating between necessary firmness and genuine compassion. never raising voices or showing frustration even when Margaret accused them of being disguised government agents sent to kidnap her and perform secret scientific experiments. "Mom, please, these professionals just want to help you. You need urgent medical care because clearly something very serious is happening to you that isn't your fault but needs immediate specialized treatment," I begged repeatedly, feeling hot tears running down my cheeks as I watched this woman I desperately loved transforming into a paranoid and aggressive stranger before my helpless eyes. Finally, after multiple promises that they would only go to the hospital for quick exams and then she could come home, Margaret reluctantly agreed to enter the ambulance, although she continued murmuring conspiracy theories about implanted microchips and satellite surveillance that supposedly monitored her every movement. The 23-minute trip to the municipal psychiatric hospital located on the city outskirts was a surreal and emotionally devastating experience that made me deeply question whether I really knew the woman who raised me, or if there had always been a hidden part of her psyche that was now emerging through mental fissures caused by some unknown trigger. Sitting beside her on the narrow ambulance bench while medical equipment jingled and swayed at every curve of the poorly paved road, I watched, fascinated and terrified, as Margaret alternated between moments of relative lucidity, where she seemed to vaguely recognize me, and periods of intense paranoia, where she again accused me of being an imposter sent by secret organizations. "Julia, my dear daughter, I'm sorry for all this. I think I haven't been feeling very well lately," she murmured during brief intervals of mental clarity, her wrinkled hand searching for mine with hesitant gestures that vaguely reminded me of the affectionate mother I had known throughout my life. But seconds later, her eyes would glaze over again and she would recoil abruptly, shrinking against the metal wall of the ambulance as if my presence represented immediate mortal threat. The oscillation between recognition and delusion was so rapid and unpredictable that I began to feel dizzy and disoriented, questioning my own perception of reality while desperately trying to find rational explanations for this sudden and apparently inexplicable psychological transformation. The psychiatric hospital was an austere institutional building of 5 floors, painted in tones of faded beige and melancholic gray, that conveyed exactly the kind of oppressive atmosphere that characterizes mental facilities, funded by insufficient government budgets and overburdened by demand far exceeding available care capacity. When we descended from the ambulance in the psychiatric emergency area, illuminated by flickering fluorescent lights that created ghostly shadows on the peeling walls, I was immediately confronted by the brutal reality of how many people were simultaneously experiencing severe mental crises on that specific ordinary Tuesday dawn. The waiting room was packed with exhausted families holding agitated patients who screamed incoherencies, people in straitjackets being monitored by muscular security guards, and mainly a characteristic smell of cheap hospital disinfectant, mixed with human sweat and palpable fear that permeated the entire claustrophobic environment. Margaret was immediately led by the paramedics to a separate triage room where nurses specialized in emergency psychiatry would perform initial assessment of her mental and physical state to determine the appropriate level of care and restraint necessary. Nurse Sonia, a 46-year-old black woman with curly hair pulled back in an impeccable professional bun and brown eyes that demonstrated decades of experience dealing with the darkest aspects of the human psyche, received me with a rare combination of professional efficiency and genuine human compassion. "Mrs. Julia, I completely understand how frightening and painful it must be to witness your mother going through an acute psychotic crisis, but I want to assure you that we will do absolutely everything within our power to stabilize her and discover the underlying cause of these symptoms," she said, leading me to a small private consultation room while other professionals began the process of examining Margaret in an adjacent room. "I need to ask some detailed questions about your mother's medical history, recent behavioral changes you may have observed, medications she takes regularly, and mainly about any traumatic or stressful event that might have triggered this sudden crisis." During the following hour, I meticulously reported every detail I could remember about the last weeks of Margaret's life, from apparently harmless forgetfulness of where she had left car keys to progressively more bizarre accusations about neighbors supposedly entering her house during the night to rearrange furniture and steal non-existent important documents. Dr. Henry Tavares, the psychiatrist responsible for the night shift at that hospital, was a 53-year-old man with dark hair generously sprinkled with gray strands that conferred an air of experienced medical authority, reading glasses hanging on a metal chain around his neck. and mainly a facial expression that alternated between genuine clinical interest and chronic fatigue characteristic of medical professionals working in perpetually underfunded and overloaded health systems. He entered the consultation room carrying a thick folder full of standardized medical forms and greeted me with a firm but impersonal handshake that immediately established the professional boundaries of our interaction. "Mrs. Julia, I've preliminarily examined your mother and the symptoms she presents: intense paranoia, persecution delusions, loss of recognition of close family members, a typical aggressive behavior, indicate possible acute psychotic episode that may have multiple underlying causes, including brain infection, tumor, adverse reaction to medications, or sudden development of primary psychiatric conditions such as late onset schizophrenia," he explained, consulting his notes while speaking. "I'm going to admit her for intensive observation of 72 hours, during which we'll perform a complete battery of neurological exams, blood analyses, brain MRI, and mainly constant behavioral monitoring to determine precise diagnosis and appropriate treatment plan." The decision to compulsorily admit Margaret was simultaneously the easiest and most devastating I made on that apocalyptic dawn, because although all clinical signs clearly indicated she represented imminent danger to herself and possibly to other people around her, my maternal heart was internally torn by signing official documents that authorized unknown medical professionals to keep my mother detained against her expressed will in psychiatric facilities that seemed more like prisons than hospitals. Dr. Henry patiently explained that compulsory admission was a legal procedure provided in specific mental health legislation when patients in acute psychotic crisis represent risk to themselves or third parties. But his technical and rational words did little to alleviate the overwhelming guilt I felt at transforming my own mother into an involuntary prisoner of a system I barely understood and frankly feared. "Mrs. Julia, I completely understand this is extremely emotionally difficult for you. But you need to understand that your mother is not in mental condition to make rational decisions about her own medical treatment at this critical moment," he said, pushing printed forms across the scratched desk that separated us. "If we let her leave without appropriate treatment, there's substantial risk that she'll seriously hurt herself during a paranoid episode, or worse yet, harm other people she mistakenly believes are threats to her safety." His words were logical and professionally grounded, but each syllable seemed like an additional stab to the already torn fabric of my maternal conscience. The bureaucratic process of compulsory admission proved surprisingly complex and time-consuming, involving multiple signatures on different legal documents, detailed explanations about patient rights that ironically didn't include the right to refuse treatment when judged mentally incapable, and mainly difficult conversations with social workers who needed to verify I was really acting in Margaret's best interest rather than trying to get rid of an inconvenient relative through undue psychiatric admission. "We need to ask these questions to all families. It's nothing personal against you specifically," explained a tired social worker named Beatrice, a woman of approximately 50 years, with artificially dyed blonde hair and glasses hanging on a colorful chain around her neck. "Unfortunately, there are cases where family members try to admit healthy people for financial or inheritance reasons, so we have rigorous protocols to ensure every compulsory admission is genuinely necessary from a medical standpoint." For 45 interminable minutes, I answered invasive questions about my relationship with Margaret, our family history, whether there were financial disputes or personal conflicts that could motivate my desire to admit her, and mainly whether I understood that psychiatric admission wasn't a permanent solution, but rather a temporary intervention for acute crisis stabilization. While I filled out endless forms in an administrative room with noisy air conditioning that worked irregularly, Margaret was being kept in a separate observation room under constant supervision of nurses trained in restraining violent or fleeing psychiatric patients. Through the small reinforced glass window in the metal door, I was able to observe her briefly during one of the many intervals in the bureaucratic process. She was sitting in a white plastic chair bolted to the concrete floor, still wearing the torn and blood-stained nightgown from the shoulder scratch, rocking her body rhythmically back and forth while her lips moved rapidly in silent monologue with invisible interlocutors that only she could perceive in her altered reality. The sight of the woman who raised me with so much love and dedication, reduced to that state of absolute mental confusion, made me deeply question whether I was making the correct decision by compulsorily admitting her. But Nurse Sonia, who had become my unexpected ally during that traumatic night, gently held my shoulder and assured me I was doing exactly what any responsible daughter would do under the same impossible circumstances. "Julia, I know you're feeling guilty about admitting your mother against her will, but you need to understand that at this specific moment, Margaret doesn't possess mental capacity to comprehend that she needs urgent medical help. Sonia explained to me with a rare combination of professional firmness and genuine human compassion that characterized experienced nurses who chose to work in emergency psychiatry out of genuine vocation rather than mere professional convenience. When she stabilizes through appropriate medication and intensive therapy, she'll probably thank you for making this difficult decision today. Even though right now she's furious and frightened because she can't rationally understand what's happening with her own mind. Her words offered temporary comfort, but didn't completely eliminate the persistent sensation that I was betraying my mother by authorizing them to keep her imprisoned in a psychiatric institution against her expressed and repeated wishes to return home immediately. Finally, after signing what seemed like at least 20 different documents, Margaret was officially admitted to the intensive psychiatric observation ward of the hospital for an initial period of 72 hours, during which a multidisciplinary medical team would conduct comprehensive assessments to determine precise diagnosis and appropriate treatment plan. Dr. Henry explained in detail what would happen during these 3 critical days: neurological exams to rule out physical causes like brain tumors or infections, complete blood analyses to check for chemical imbalances or adverse drug reactions, brain MRI to visualize internal structures and identify possible anomalies, daily psychiatric evaluations to monitor symptom evolution, and mainly careful administration of antipsychotic medications to control delusions and hallucinations that were making Margaret a danger to herself. After the initial 72 hours of intensive observation, we'll do a complete reassessment and decide whether she can be discharged with outpatient follow-up or if she needs prolonged admission to specialized psychiatric facilities, he concluded, closing the thick folder that now contained all medical and legal documentation related to my mother's case. When I was finally allowed to see Margaret before leaving the hospital on that morning that had already fully dawned, I found her lying in a narrow hospital bed in a shared room with 3 other psychiatric patients in varying states of agitation and mental confusion. Now wearing a standard light blue hospital gown that had replaced the destroyed nightgown she wore during the destructive outbreak, she was sedated with emergency medication that doctors had administered to control the extreme agitation she had shown when she finally understood she wouldn't be allowed to return home immediately. And her pale face displayed an expression of drugged confusion that was even more disturbing than the intense paranoia she had demonstrated hours before. "Julia, my daughter, why are you doing this to me? Why are you letting these bad people keep me locked up here when I just want to go back to my house?" she murmured with a voice slurred by heavy sedation, her faded blue eyes struggling to focus on my face while her trembling hand reached weakly in my direction through the side rails of the hospital bed. Each word from her pierced my heart like heated needles, making me question again whether compulsory admission was really necessary, or if I was simply choosing the most convenient solution instead of finding less traumatic alternatives to deal with my mother's mental crisis. "Mom, you're in a hospital because you need urgent medical help. Something is happening to you that doctors need to investigate and treat properly before you can safely return home," I tried to explain with a voice that struggled to remain calm and comforting, despite the emotional turmoil devastating my interior. "I promise I'll visit you every day while you're here. I'll bring your favorite personal things. I'll make sure the doctors are taking good care of you. But you need to try to cooperate with the treatments because they just want to help you get better." Margaret looked at me with an expression that alternated between genuine confusion and something that seemed dangerously close to betrayed accusation, as if she were finally beginning to understand through the fog of sedation that her own daughter had authorized her involuntary detention in a psychiatric institution. "You betrayed me. You joined them against me. You're part of the conspiracy I knew existed," she whispered with a voice choked not only by medication, but also by tears that were beginning to form in the corners of her tired eyes. Her words were manifestly delusional, a direct product of the paranoia characterizing her psychotic state, but still carried devastating emotional weight that would make me question my decision for weeks to come. Leaving that psychiatric hospital on that Wednesday morning that was already completely illuminated by the rising sun was one of the most difficult experiences I had faced until that moment in my adult life, because it meant temporarily abandoning my mother in the hands of professional strangers in an institution that seemed more like a prison than a place of healing, blindly trusting that they would know how to help her when I myself felt completely lost and powerless before the mental disintegration I was witnessing. I drove my car back home in a state of emotional autopilot, barely able to focus on the road while my mind obsessively revisited every moment of the traumatic night I had just experienced, desperately searching for signs I might have missed. clues that could have alerted me in advance about the imminent mental crisis that had now exploded with devastating force. When I finally arrived home and opened the front door, I was immediately confronted by the scene of destruction Margaret had left behind: broken glass scattered across the entire living room floor, curtains torn from windows, overturned and damaged furniture, ripped pillows with synthetic filling, forming artificial white snowfalls in every corner of the environment that until a few hours before had represented my personal sanctuary of peace and security. The task of physically cleaning up the wreckage left by Margaret's destructive outbreak became simultaneously a therapeutic process and psychological torture. Because each shard of glass I carefully swept into resistant garbage bags represented an additional fragment of my previous belief in the stability and predictability of family life. During 3 interminable hours of methodical cleaning, crying silently while reorganizing furniture and trying to repair damages that went far beyond the merely physical and material, I gradually began to process the devastating reality that my mother was gravely mentally ill, and that our lives had irreversibly changed during that apocalyptic dawn. The Chinese porcelain vase inherited from my maternal grandmother, the one Margaret had threateningly held during the worst moments of the outbreak, had miraculously survived intact because the paramedics managed to convince her to put it down before transporting her to the ambulance. But now it remained on the living room table as a silent and ironic reminder of how close I had come to losing not just an irreplaceable family heirloom, but also possibly my own mother if the situation had escalated to uncontrolled physical violence. The following 24 hours passed in a surreal fog of physical exhaustion combined with emotional overload that left me functioning in basic survival mode, performing essential tasks like showering and eating minimally, only because some rational part of my brain recognized I needed to keep my own body functioning if I wanted to have energy to deal with the family crisis that now completely dominated every aspect of my existence. I tried calling my father Richard on Thursday morning, but he didn't answer any of the 6 calls I made during the day. Typical behavior of a man who had spent the last 2 decades essentially absent from our lives, except for sporadic appearances on important holidays and obligatory birthdays, when his paternal guilt occasionally overcame his chronic indifference. My sister Paula, 40 years of professional skepticism developed through a successful career in financial auditing, where suspecting everything and everyone was considered a virtue rather than a character flaw, finally returned my urgent call late Thursday afternoon. Listening to my detailed account of Margaret's outbreak with tense silence that I initially interpreted as emotional shock, but gradually realized was something closer to skeptical disbelief. "Julia, I'm going to be completely honest with you because we're sisters, and I don't have time or patience for diplomatic conversations that avoid uncomfortable truths," Paula said with that direct and straightforward tone that characterized all her personal and professional communications. "Are you absolutely certain Mom really had a genuine psychotic break? Or is there a possibility she was just being dramatic for attention or emotionally manipulating you for some reason we don't fully understand yet?" Her words left me momentarily speechless. Not just because of the outrageous suggestion that Margaret could be faking severe psychiatric symptoms, but mainly because they revealed how profoundly different Paula's relationship with our mother was compared to the intimate emotional connection I had always maintained. "Paula, I personally saw her state, witnessed the physical destruction of my house, heard the delusional accusations about conspiracies and espionage, observed how she didn't recognize me as her daughter during the worst moments of the episode." I responded with growing indignation I could barely control. The doctors at the psychiatric hospital confirmed she was clearly in acute psychotic crisis requiring immediate compulsory admission. "So I don't understand where this absurd suggestion comes from that it could all be manipulative theater." Paula sighed deeply on the other end of the phone line. That particular sigh she always used when she believed she was dealing with people less intelligent or more naive than she considered herself. "Julia, you've always been the emotionally close daughter to Mom, the one who maintained constant contact and visited regularly. So maybe your view is a bit distorted by decades of excessive emotional involvement," she explained with a condescending tone that made my blood boil. "I've maintained healthy distance from both our parents for years specifically because I learned through professional experience that often the people closest to us are the ones who can manipulate us most effectively through exploitation of emotional bonds." Her words were technically rational from a purely logical perspective, but completely failed to recognize the obvious reality that Margaret was genuinely suffering from a serious psychiatric condition that had absolutely nothing to do with conscious manipulation or fabricated drama. "Paula, I'll send you photos of the damage to my house, copies of hospital medical reports, security camera recordings if necessary. any evidence you need to finally believe our mother is gravely mentally ill and urgently needs family support instead of destructive skepticism," I declared with a firmness that surprised both of us, considering I had historically always been the more diplomatic and conciliatory sister in our family conflicts. The call ended with Paula reluctantly agreeing to visit Margaret at the psychiatric hospital during the weekend. Although her tone of voice made it absolutely clear she continued to be skeptical about the real severity of the situation, and probably suspected both Margaret and I were dramatically exaggerating what she considered likely just temporary stress or exaggerated emotional reaction that could be resolved through a few outpatient therapy sessions instead of complete psychiatric admission. I hung up the phone feeling simultaneously furious with Paula's obstinate refusal to believe in the seriousness of Margaret's mental crisis, and also deeply lonely in the growing perception that I would be the only person in the nuclear family willing to assume primary responsibility for caring for our mother during the long process of diagnosis, treatment, and recovery that was clearly only beginning. During the following hours of that emotionally exhausting Thursday, I spent significant time desperately trying to contact my father, Richard, through repeated phone calls, increasingly urgent text messages, and finally even formal email explaining in detail Margaret's critical situation and requesting his immediate presence to deal together with the family crisis that obviously required involvement of both parents, instead of leaving all responsibility to fall exclusively on me as the eldest daughter. Richard finally returned my contact at 9:15 that Thursday night, calling from an unknown number that initially made me hesitate before answering, fearing it was inconvenient telemarketing or a collection call related to some bill I had forgotten to pay during the emotional chaos of recent days. "Julia, I received your multiple messages about your mother being in the psychiatric hospital. And honestly, I need to say I'm not surprised she finally had some kind of mental breakdown considering the level of stress she always maintained in her life through excessive worries and chronic anxiety," he said with that casual and slightly indifferent tone that always characterized his rare communications about serious family matters. His first words immediately revealed two disturbing truths. First, that he didn't consider Margaret's psychotic break as an urgent medical emergency requiring his immediate attention. And second, that he apparently maintained a long-standing negative opinion about my mother's mental health that he had never shared with me during all the years they were married and subsequently divorced. "Dad, Mom didn't simply have some kind of mental breakdown as you're so casually minimizing," I responded with barely controlled indignation. "She had a severe acute psychotic crisis that resulted in significant physical destruction of my house, severe paranoid delusions about conspiracies and espionage, complete loss of recognition of close family members, and potentially violent behavior that necessitated emergency compulsory admission to a psychiatric hospital." The silence that followed my detailed description lasted long enough for me to start wondering if the call had dropped. But then Richard finally responded with a tone combining obvious discomfort with something dangerously close to irritation at being forced to deal with a family matter he clearly preferred to avoid completely. "Julia, I appreciate that you're concerned about your mother, but you need to understand that my relationship with Margaret definitively ended almost 2 decades ago when we divorced. And frankly, I don't feel responsible for dealing with any medical or psychiatric problems she may be experiencing in her adult life," he declared with bureaucratic coldness that made me question whether this distant and indifferent man was really the same father I vaguely remembered from old photographs of my childhood before the divorce. "I suggest you contact her sister or other relatives from the maternal side of the family, who may be emotionally closer and therefore more appropriate to help with her medical situation." His words were technically defensible from a perspective of individual rights and reasonable personal boundaries, but completely failed to recognize that Margaret was the mother of his 2 daughters, and therefore he had at minimum a moral responsibility to demonstrate some level of concern or offer support during a serious family crisis. "Dad, I'm not asking you to resume a romantic relationship with Mom or assume complete financial responsibility for her medical treatment," I explained with forced patience that required tremendous conscious effort considering my growing frustration. "I'm just requesting that you, as the father of her daughters and someone who shared 20 years of marriage with her, demonstrate a minimum level of basic human decency by visiting the hospital to check how she is, and mainly talking with doctors to understand the diagnosis and prognosis of the psychiatric condition that clearly is serious enough to have required compulsory admission." Richard sighed audibly and at length on the other end of the phone line, and from the tired tone of his breathing, I could perfectly imagine the expression of contained irritation that was probably stamped on his aged face as he mentally calculated how much minimum effort would be necessary to satisfy me enough that I would stop bothering him with matters related to his ex-wife that he clearly considered exclusively my and Paula's problem. Julia, I'm going to be very clear and direct with you because apparently subtleties aren't working in this progressively frustrating conversation for both of us, he finally said with a tone that had completely abandoned any pretense of paternal cordiality. Margaret always had dramatic tendencies and excessive need for attention throughout our entire marriage. One of the multiple reasons why our relationship eventually became unsustainable and culminated in a divorce that was the best decision I made in my adult life. Whether she's now having some kind of genuine psychiatric crisis or simply escalated her habitual dramatic performances to a level that finally got the professional medical attention she always sought, frankly, it's no longer my responsibility to determine or resolve. His words were so cruel and devoid of basic empathy that for a moment I was completely speechless, struggling to mentally process how someone could speak with such calculated coldness about the mother of his own daughters who was hospitalized in a serious mental crisis. Are you seriously suggesting Mom spent 3 entire decades pretending to be a mentally stable person just to eventually have the opportunity to stage an elaborate psychotic break that would completely fool multiple medical professionals specifically trained to identify simulation of psychiatric symptoms? I asked with incredulity rapidly transforming into pure and unfiltered anger. Dad, I know you and Mom had a difficult and complicated divorce that left emotional scars on everyone involved, but that doesn't give you the right to minimize or question the validity of a genuine medical crisis happening now, regardless of whatever problems existed in your marriage 2 decades ago. Richard laughed briefly with a dry and bitter sound containing no trace of genuine humor, only cynicism accumulated through years of resentment not properly processed. Julia, you were only 17 when your mother and I divorced. So there are many complex dynamics of our relationship you simply weren't in a position to observe or fully understand at the time, he explained with a condescending tone, treating me like a naive child instead of a 37-year-old adult woman perfectly capable of assessing complex situations. Margaret was always a master of subtle emotional manipulation, always knew exactly which buttons to press to get sympathy and attention from people around her. And apparently this skill continues working perfectly well decades later, considering how completely convinced you are that she's an innocent victim of sudden mental illness instead of a person who finally took her dramatic tendencies too far. The conversation with Richard continued deteriorating progressively for another 15 painful minutes, where each attempt of mine to make him understand the real gravity of Margaret's situation was met with more skepticism, more veiled accusations about supposed historical emotional manipulations, and mainly more categorical refusals to assume any responsibility or even demonstrate basic interest in personally checking the state of the mother of his daughters who was hospitalized against her will in a psychiatric institution. Eventually, I realized continuing to argue would be completely useless because Richard had clearly constructed an elaborate narrative over years that transformed Margaret into the manipulative villain of all their marriage problems, a narrative he had no interest whatsoever in questioning or revising even in the face of objective medical evidence of genuine psychiatric crisis. Dad, I'm deeply disappointed and frankly ashamed by your refusal to demonstrate a minimum level of basic human decency in this situation. But obviously I can't force you to care about the well-being of the mother of your daughters, I finally said with a tone of defeated resignation. I'll deal with this family crisis alone, as apparently I always do with all responsibilities related to our parents, while you and Paula maintain your convenient distances and justify your absence through elaborate rationalizations about healthy boundaries and emotional protection. I hung up the phone before Richard could respond, not because I feared what he might say, but simply because I had no more emotional energy to continue trying to extract basic compassion from a person who had clearly decided decades ago that ex-spouses didn't deserve even minimum consideration during serious medical emergencies. The following 72 hours of Margaret's intensive observation at the psychiatric hospital passed at a pace simultaneously glacial and vertiginous, each minute seeming to drag infinitely while I anxiously waited for medical updates, but the 3 complete days disappearing in a blur of daily hospital visits, tense conversations with medical staff, and mainly sleepless nights at home, where I stayed awake until dawn, obsessively reviewing every interaction I had had with Margaret in the weeks before the outbreak, desperately searching for warning signs I should have noticed in advance. I visited Margaret religiously every day during the initial 72 hours of observation, as I had promised, arriving at the psychiatric hospital exactly at 2 in the afternoon when visiting hours began, and remaining until 4 o'clock, when nurses gently but firmly informed me I needed to leave to allow patients time to rest, before the institutional dinner served at 5 o'clock sharp. Each visit was an emotionally devastating experience that left me exhausted and repeatedly questioning whether Margaret was really improving under intensive medical care, or if she was simply being kept in a state of chemical sedation that masked symptoms without actually treating them adequately. During my first visit on Thursday afternoon, approximately 12 hours after leaving Margaret at the hospital, I found her significantly more lucid than she had been during the chaotic hours of the previous dawn, although still clearly under heavy influence of antipsychotic medications that left her movements slow and her speech slurred in a disturbing manner. She was sitting in a plastic chair beside the hospital bed, wearing the same light blue gown she had worn in the morning, but now with hair partially combed by some compassionate nurse who apparently had tried to restore some basic dignity to her deteriorated physical appearance. "Julia, my daughter, you came to visit me," she said when she saw me entering the shared room. And although her words were grammatically confused and technically didn't make complete sense, the fact that she immediately recognized me as her daughter, instead of accusing me of being an imposter, sent by imaginary conspirators, represented significant progress that filled me with cautious hope. I sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair beside her and held her wrinkled hand that seemed surprisingly fragile and small compared to the memories I had of the strong and competent hands that had guided me throughout my entire childhood and adolescence. "Mom, I'm here. I came to visit you every day while you're in the hospital. I promised I would do this, and I always keep my promises." I responded with a voice struggling to remain stable despite the conflicting emotions flooding me at seeing my mother in that vulnerable and confused state. Margaret looked at me with an expression mixing genuine confusion about where she was and why she was there, with vague awareness that something serious had happened resulting in her presence in that strange and frightening institutional place. "Julia, dear daughter, why am I in this place with all these sick people around me? What happened that I can't remember properly?" she asked with a weak and hesitant voice revealing both the effects of heavy medication and genuine disorientation about recent events. During the following 40 minutes of my visit, I tried to explain carefully and in simple terms what had happened during Tuesday dawn, the destructive outbreak in my house, the paranoid accusations about imaginary conspiracies, the need to call an emergency ambulance, the medical evaluation that determined she needed temporary psychiatric admission for her own safety. Margaret listened to my account with an increasingly disturbed expression, clearly struggling to reconcile my description of bizarre and violent behavior with her own complete lack of memories about those crucial hours. "Julia, I don't remember any of this you're describing. The last thing I clearly recall is being at home watching a television program at night, and then I wake up here in this hospital without understanding how I got here, or why I'm being kept against my will," she said, with a tone alternating between genuine confusion and beginning frustration about her involuntary detention. The conversation during that first visit proved delicate and emotionally charged, because Margaret was beginning to regain sufficient consciousness to question her admission, but still didn't possess complete mental capacity to understand or rationally accept that she had experienced a severe psychotic episode legitimately requiring emergency medical intervention. "Mom, the doctors explained to me that it's common for patients not to have clear memories about periods of acute psychotic crisis because during these episodes the brain is functioning in a very different way from normal," I tried to explain using information Nurse Sonia had shared with me. "What's important now is that you cooperate with the treatments the medical team is providing. Take medications as prescribed, participate in therapy sessions, and mainly allow neurological exams and blood analyses to be completed so doctors can determine exactly what caused this episode and how to prevent future occurrences." Margaret nodded her head slowly, although the expression on her face suggested she wasn't completely convinced of the need for all those invasive medical procedures, and mainly the need to remain hospitalized when she felt she could simply return home and resume normal life as if nothing had happened. When visiting hours ended and a nurse came to gently inform me I needed to leave, Margaret grabbed my hand with surprising force considering her debilitated state, and pleaded with supplicating eyes for me to take her home immediately. "Julia, please, don't leave me here alone with these strange people. I want to go back to my house where I feel safe and comfortable," she asked with a broken voice that pierced my heart like a sharp knife. "I promise I'll take whatever medication doctors prescribe. I'll do outpatient consultations as many times as necessary, but please don't force me to stay admitted in this horrible place that seems more like a prison than a hospital." Her pleas were emotionally devastating, but I knew I needed to remain firm because Dr. Henry had explicitly explained to me that interrupting admission prematurely before completing comprehensive medical evaluations could result in serious consequences, including rapid recurrence of psychotic symptoms, possibly with even greater intensity. Mom, I know being here is uncomfortable and frightening, but you need to trust me when I say this is absolutely necessary for your health and safety. I responded with firmness, requiring tremendous effort, considering how every fiber of my being wanted to yield to her pleas and simply take her home where we could pretend none of this had happened. It's just 2 more days of observation, and then doctors will reassess whether you can be discharged with outpatient follow-up or if you need additional treatment in specialized facilities. The second visit on Friday afternoon revealed subtle but significant changes in Margaret's mental state that left me simultaneously hopeful about her recovery and concerned about the person she was becoming under the influence of heavy psychiatric medications being administered regularly. She seemed more alert and oriented compared to the previous day, capable of maintaining longer and more coherent conversations about various subjects. But there was also a strange and slightly artificial quality in her mannerisms that made me feel like I was talking with a slightly altered version of my mother, instead of the genuine person I had known for 3 decades. Julia, the doctors came to talk with me this morning about preliminary results of exams they did yesterday, she told me as soon as I sat beside her. Apparently, blood analyses showed some chemical imbalances, but nothing indicating brain tumor or serious infection, which I suppose is good news considering the terrifying alternatives my anxious mind had imagined during a sleepless night. Her words demonstrated gradual return of more sophisticated cognitive capabilities, including abstract thinking and processing of complex medical information, positive signs suggesting medications were helping stabilize her mental condition without completely compromising her basic intellectual functions. During that second visit, Margaret also began asking more detailed questions about the destructive outbreak I had described during our conversation the previous day, demonstrating not only growing curiosity about what had happened during those lost hours of her memory, but also worrying beginning of self-awareness about the gravity of the psychotic episode she had experienced. Julia, you mentioned yesterday I destroyed things in your house during the outbreak. Did it cause serious damage requiring expensive repairs, or were they just small damages easily fixable? She asked with a voice loaded with anticipatory guilt. I hesitated briefly before responding because I didn't want to add unnecessary emotional stress while she was still in a delicate process of mental stabilization, but I also recognized she would eventually need to confront the complete reality of what had happened instead of living in protective but unsustainable ignorance. Mom, there was significant damage, including a lot of broken glass, torn curtains, damaged furniture, but nothing that can't be repaired or replaced with time and effort. I responded with carefully calibrated honesty, acknowledging the seriousness of the situation without exaggerating unnecessarily disturbing details. What's important isn't the material objects that can be fixed or replaced, but ensuring you receive appropriate treatment so episodes like this don't repeat in the future. The third and final visit during the initial 72-hour intensive observation period happened on Saturday afternoon, a crucial moment, because in the following hours, the multidisciplinary medical team would meet to evaluate complete results of all neurological exams, blood analyses, brain MRIs, and mainly detailed behavioral observations that had been systematically collected during the 3 days of admission to determine official diagnosis and recommended treatment plan. Margaret was visibly anxious when I arrived for the visit, her trembling hands nervously playing with the hem of the hospital gown, while her eyes followed me as soon as I entered the shared room. Julia, I'm terrified about what doctors will say during the evaluation meeting this afternoon. I'm having waking nightmares imagining scenarios where they diagnose me with incurable mental conditions requiring permanent admission to a psychiatric institution for the rest of my life, she confessed immediately as soon as I sat beside her. I held her trembling hands, trying to transmit comfort and security through simple but significant physical contact. Mom, regardless of what the official diagnosis is, we'll face it together and find the best available treatment path to help you manage your mental condition and resume the quality of life you deserve, I assured with conviction, trying to project more firmness than I actually felt internally, considering my own anxieties about what medical results might reveal. During that last visit of the initial observation period, Paula finally appeared as she had reluctantly promised during our tense Thursday phone conversation, arriving at the hospital approximately 30 minutes after my usual visiting time, with a carefully neutral facial expression, revealing little about her genuine thoughts or emotions about the situation she was about to confront. Julia, Margaret, she greeted formally as soon as she entered the room, maintaining notable physical distance by remaining near the door instead of approaching the hospital bed where our mother was sitting. Margaret looked at Paula with a complex mixture of maternal hope and anticipated fear of rejection, clearly uncertain about how her more distant and skeptical daughter would react to seeing her in the vulnerable state of a hospitalized psychiatric patient. Paula, daughter, thank you for coming to visit me, even though I know you have a busy life and probably would rather be doing anything else on a sunny Saturday afternoon, Margaret said with a tone trying to sound casual but carrying obvious emotional weight of a mother desperately desiring approval and acceptance from a daughter who had maintained significant emotional distance for years. Paula walked slowly to where we were sitting, her dark eyes methodically examining the institutional hospital environment and mainly observing Margaret with analytical attention that seemed more appropriate for professional financial audit than for family visit in a delicate medical context. Mom, Julia told me about the outbreak you had Tuesday dawn and about the subsequent psychiatric admission doctors determined necessary for your safety. Paula began with a clinically neutral tone that could have been appropriate for a corporate meeting, but sounded strangely cold and disconnected in the context of an intimate family crisis. I want you to know that despite maintaining distance in our relationship for complex personal reasons, obviously I don't wish for you to suffer or experience serious health problems, whether physical or mental. Her words were technically compassionate, but delivered with such lack of genuine emotional warmth, they almost seemed insulting in their calculated coldness. Margaret accepted Paula's minimal declaration with a small and sad nod, clearly disappointed by the lack of warmer demonstration of maternal concern, but apparently not surprised considering the established pattern of emotionally limited interactions between them during previous years. During the following 20 minutes, I watched with growing frustration while Paula conducted what was essentially a clinical interrogation of Margaret about her symptoms, medical treatments she was receiving, and mainly about future plans for long-term management of her apparently newly diagnosed psychiatric condition. Each question Paula asked was formulated with technical precision, demonstrating her sharp analytical intelligence, but completely lacked the basic human empathy the situation clearly required. Paula, can I speak with you privately for a moment? I finally interrupted after witnessing the cold interrogation that was visibly disturbing Margaret, instead of providing the comfort or support a family visit should ideally offer. Paula followed me to the hallway outside the shared room where we could talk without being heard by Margaret or other admitted psychiatric patients. Paula, I understand you maintain emotional distance from Mom for personal reasons I won't question now, but frankly your conduct of this visit is being more harmful than helpful, I said with direct frankness I normally avoided in our interactions to maintain superficial family peace. Mom doesn't need to be interrogated like a witness in a corporate investigation. She needs basic emotional support, genuine expressions of concern and care, assurances that family will be present to help her during the difficult process of diagnosis and treatment that clearly is only beginning. Paula looked at me with an expression combining obvious defensiveness with something that could have been minimal embarrassment about her clinically cold approach to the situation. Julia, unlike you who always had an emotionally close and enmeshed relationship with Mom, I learned years ago to maintain healthy boundaries that protect my own mental health from being dragged into family dramas that often seem specifically designed to extract attention and emotional energy from people around them, she explained with a defensive tone. Before I could respond to Paula's elaborate justification about her cold and distant behavior, we were interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Henry, who was walking rapidly down the hallway carrying a thick folder, presumably containing complete results of all Margaret's medical evaluations during the 72-hour intensive observation period. Mrs. Julia, Mrs. Paula, I was looking for you specifically because we just concluded the multidisciplinary team meeting about your mother's case and would like to discuss evaluation results and treatment recommendations with family members before presenting them directly to the patient, he said with a serious professional tone that immediately made my stomach contract in anxious anticipation about what news he was about to share. We followed Dr. Henry to a small private conference room adjacent to the intensive psychiatric observation ward, an austere environment furnished only with a scratched meeting table and uncomfortable plastic chairs that had clearly witnessed countless similar difficult conversations between medical professionals and devastated families. Please sit down. This may take some time to explain adequately, Dr. Henry said, organizing various medical documents on the table while Paula and I settled into chairs with tense expressions of anticipated apprehension about imminent medical revelations. The diagnosis fell on me like tons of bricks being dumped simultaneously, each word weighing infinitely more than should be possible for mere vocalized sounds. Schizophrenia, a serious and chronic mental illness I had always vaguely associated with dramatic films about severely incapacitated psychiatric patients living permanently in institutions, Not with my mother, who until 3 days ago had been a functional and independent woman perfectly capable of managing her own daily life. Dr. Henry, when you mention late-onset schizophrenia, does that mean Mom will need medication for the rest of her life? Will have recurrent psychotic episodes periodically? Will progressively lose the capacity to function independently? I managed to articulate with a voice sounding strangely calm considering the emotional turmoil devastating my interior. Dr. Henry nervously adjusted his glasses, a gesture I was beginning to recognize as a sign he was about to share particularly difficult or complex information. Late-onset schizophrenia, defined as first psychotic episode occurring after 50 years of age, generally has a slightly better prognosis than early-onset schizophrenia, manifesting during adolescence or early adult life, he explained carefully. Many patients with late-onset schizophrenia manage to maintain relatively good quality of life through a combination of regular antipsychotic medication, continuous psychosocial therapy, and mainly strong family support that helps monitor early signs of relapse before they evolve into complete psychotic episodes. Paula, who had remained silent during Dr. Henry's entire initial explanation, finally spoke with a tone mixing her habitual professional skepticism with genuine concern she rarely demonstrated openly. Doctor, what level of certainty does the medical team have about this schizophrenia diagnosis, considering you observed Mom only during 3 relatively short days and based conclusions mainly on a single psychotic episode without documented prior history of similar symptoms? She asked with precision, reflecting her auditing training where questioning assumptions and verifying bases of conclusions was standard practice. Dr. Henry nodded his head appreciatively, clearly recognizing the validity of Paula's skeptical question. Mrs. Paula, I completely recognize 3 days of observation is a relatively limited period to establish a complex psychiatric diagnosis with absolute certainty, which is why I specified this is a preliminary diagnosis rather than a definitive final conclusion, he responded professionally. However, the specific pattern and particular combination of symptoms Mrs. Margaret presented, systematized paranoid delusions, auditory hallucinations, severe behavioral disorganization, correspond precisely to established diagnostic criteria for schizophrenia, as defined in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, universally used by mental health professionals. Additionally, the sudden onset of psychotic symptoms without obvious precipitating factors like recent trauma, extreme stress, or use of psychoactive substances strongly suggests a primary pathological process rather than a secondary psychological reaction to external circumstances. The following 2 hours of that Saturday afternoon were dedicated to detailed discussion about the recommended treatment plan that Dr. Henry and the multidisciplinary team had developed based on the preliminary diagnosis of late-onset schizophrenia and comprehensive assessment of Margaret's specific needs. The primary recommendation was continuation of the antipsychotic medication that had been initiated during hospitalization, specifically a drug called risperidone that Dr. Henry explained was considered first-line treatment for schizophrenia due to its relatively favorable profile of efficacy versus side effects compared to older antipsychotics. Mrs. Margaret will need to take risperidone daily indefinitely, probably for the rest of her life, to prevent recurrence of psychotic episodes and maintain basic mental stability, allowing independent functioning, Dr. Henry explained with frankness I appreciated, but that simultaneously filled me with sadness about the future my mother now faced. Medication alone isn't sufficient for optimal schizophrenia management, so we also strongly recommend regular participation in specialized psychotherapy, focused on helping patients understand their mental illness, recognize early signs of relapse, develop coping strategies to deal with stressors that can trigger symptoms, and mainly maintain consistent adherence to medication regimen, which statistically is the biggest challenge in long-term schizophrenia treatment. The moment of critical decision arrived when Dr. Henry explained the medical team was recommending Margaret's transfer to a specialized residential psychiatric facility for an additional period of 2 to 4 weeks for more complete stabilization before allowing return to independent life in the community. I understand this isn't news the family wants to hear, especially after Mrs. Margaret has already spent 3 days hospitalized. But statistically, patients with first episode of schizophrenia who receive intensive residential treatment during the initial acute phase have significantly better rates of functional recovery and lower rates of rehospitalization in subsequent years, he argued based on medical evidence. Paula and I exchanged significant glances, silently communicating without words about the impossible dilemma we faced. authorize additional prolonged admission of our mother to a residential psychiatric facility she would undoubtedly resist and possibly blame us for years to come, or insist on immediate discharge despite professional medical recommendations and risk her having a recurrent psychotic episode, possibly even more serious than the first. The decision we made at that moment would define Margaret's treatment trajectory and potentially determine whether she would eventually manage to recover some semblance of normal independent life or spend future years cycling between repeated hospitalizations and unstable periods of marginal functioning in the community. Dr. Henry, we need time to discuss this prolonged admission recommendation before making such a significant decision, Paula said with that controlled and professional voice she used when negotiating complex corporate contracts. Although I could detect an almost imperceptible tremor, revealing even she was being emotionally affected by the gravity of the situation, despite her conscious efforts to maintain clinical detachment. The psychiatrist nodded understandingly and granted us 15 minutes to deliberate in private while he went to check on other patients under his care, leaving Paula and me alone in that claustrophobic conference room where the weight of impossible decisions seemed physically palpable in the mechanically circulating air conditioning. Julia, I know you won't like what I'm going to say, but I need to be pragmatic and direct because that's how I've always dealt with complex situations throughout my professional career, Paula began as soon as Dr. Henry closed the door behind him. Prolonged psychiatric admission is extremely expensive, even in government-subsidized public facilities, will require someone from the family to assume significant legal and financial responsibility, and mainly will essentially transform you into mom's primary caregiver for the next years, considering dad clearly refused to participate, and I maintain rigid boundaries for reasons of psychological self-preservation. Her words were brutally honest in a way I simultaneously appreciated and detested, because they acknowledged practical realities I had been avoiding confronting directly during the last 3 chaotic days. Paula, I completely understand that authorizing prolonged admission means assuming enormous responsibilities that will fundamentally alter my life for the foreseeable future, I responded with a tired voice reflecting accumulated exhaustion from sleepless nights and constant emotional stress. But the alternative is bringing mom home prematurely before she's genuinely stabilized, risking her having another possibly more serious psychotic episode and potentially ending up back in this same hospital under even worse conditions within weeks or months. If the specialized medical team is recommending intensive residential treatment based on statistical evidence about better outcomes for patients with first episode of schizophrenia, then frankly, I don't feel qualified to question their professional expertise just because the decision is inconvenient or frightening for us. Paula sighed deeply and ran tired hands through her perfectly straight black hair. A rare gesture revealing even her professional composure was beginning to crack under the pressure of the impossible family situation. Julia, you've always been the more maternal daughter emotionally connected with mom, so obviously you'll make whatever decision prioritizes her emotional well-being over practical considerations, she said with a tone that wasn't exactly critical, but carried the weight of an observation she had made about our fundamental differences over decades. I just want to ensure you fully understand the magnitude of the commitment you're assuming. Because once mom is transferred to the residential facility and you sign legal documents as family responsible party, you won't be able to simply change your mind weeks later when the reality of constant hospital visits and managing recurrent psychiatric crises begins consuming all your vital energy. When Dr. Henry returned to the conference room exactly 15 minutes later as promised, he found Paula and me sitting in tense silence, but having reached reluctant consensus about authorizing Margaret's transfer to a specialized residential psychiatric facility as recommended by the medical team. Doctor, we've decided to follow the team's professional recommendation and authorize the additional 2 to 4 weeks of intensive residential treatment, I announced formally, trying to project confidence I didn't completely feel. Obviously, we have concerns about how mom will react when she learns she can't return home immediately as she was expecting, but we trust you know better than we do what treatment is necessary to maximize her chances of functional recovery. Dr. Henry seemed genuinely relieved by our decision, suggesting he had anticipated possible family resistance based on previous experiences with other families who refused recommended treatments for financial or emotional reasons. Ladies, I sincerely believe you're making the most responsible and compassionate decision possible under the extremely difficult circumstances you face, he said with a tone combining professional approval and genuine human empathy. I'll personally explain to Mrs. Margaret the preliminary diagnosis and recommended treatment plan, but it would be extremely helpful if both of you could be present during this conversation to offer emotional support and help reinforce that the decision about prolonged treatment is being made with her best interest in mind. The conversation with Margaret about the late onset schizophrenia diagnosis and need for additional prolonged admission was undoubtedly one of the most painful experiences I faced during that entire traumatic week of devastating medical discoveries and impossible family decisions. Dr. Henry conducted the discussion with an impressive combination of necessary medical frankness and emotional sensitivity about how the information would be received by a patient still processing the psychological trauma of having experienced a severe psychotic episode she couldn't even clearly remember. Mrs. Margaret, I need to share with you the results of the extensive medical evaluations the team performed during the last 3 days of intensive observation. He began carefully after Paula and I positioned ourselves beside the hospital bed where our mother was sitting with an anxious expression clearly stamped on every line of her aged face. Margaret looked quickly between our 3 faces, clearly trying to assess from our facial expressions whether the news she was about to receive would be positive or devastating, and obviously reaching the correct conclusion based on the solemn seriousness we all involuntarily projected. The good news is all physical exams ruled out serious organic causes like brain tumors or infections that could be causing your psychiatric symptoms. Dr. Henry continued, establishing a positive foundation before sharing the more complex and frightening diagnosis. However, based on the specific pattern of symptoms you presented, paranoid delusions about conspiracies, auditory hallucinations, temporary loss of recognition of family members, the medical team has determined you're experiencing what we call a first episode of late onset schizophrenia, a serious but treatable psychiatric condition requiring careful long-term medical management. I watched how the word schizophrenia impacted Margaret physically and emotionally, her face visibly paling while her hands instinctively gripped the hospital sheets as if she needed something tangible to hold on to, while processing a diagnosis that clearly terrified her deeply. Doctor, isn't schizophrenia that terrible mental illness where people permanently lose contact with reality and need to live institutionalized for the rest of their lives? She asked with a trembling voice, revealing growing panic about the diagnosis implications for her future. Dr. Henry responded with patience and clarity, explaining that late onset schizophrenia had significantly better prognosis than early onset schizophrenia, that many patients managed to maintain relatively functional and independent lives through appropriate medication and continuous therapeutic support, and mainly that the crucial first step was completing stabilization through intensive residential treatment before transitioning back to community life. When Dr. Henry finally explained the medical recommendation was transfer to a residential facility for an additional 2 to 4 weeks instead of the immediate discharge Margaret had been anxiously expecting, her reaction was exactly as anguished as I had anticipated with dread. No, absolutely not. You can't keep me locked in another psychiatric hospital for more weeks when I've already spent 3 horrible days here, she protested with a voice rapidly escalating in volume and hysteria. Julia, Paula, you're my daughters. Supposedly you love me and want what's best for me. So please don't let these doctors lock me in a mental institution as if I were a dangerous, crazy person who needs to be kept isolated from society. Her words pierced my heart with surgical precision, because they articulated exactly the fears I myself had been struggling to process since Dr. Henry presented the prolonged treatment recommendation. I approached the bed and took Margaret's trembling hands between mine, forcing her to make direct eye contact while I explained with a voice struggling to remain firm despite the tears threatening to overflow. Mom, this decision about prolonged treatment isn't being made to punish you or abandon you. But because the specialized medical team believes based on scientific evidence, you need additional intensive care to completely stabilize before you can safely return to independent life. I explained, essentially repeating arguments Dr. Henry had presented, but trying to infuse with maternal emotional warmth the professional doctor couldn't express. I know the idea of spending more weeks in a psychiatric facility is frightening and frustrating, but please trust me when I say we're doing this because we want you to recover complete mental health instead of bringing you home prematurely and risking serious relapse. During my daily visits, I gradually witnessed subtle but significant transformation in Margaret as antipsychotic medications began establishing chemical stability in her brain, and intensive therapy sessions helped her develop awareness about her mental condition and need for careful long-term management. She participated in daily therapeutic groups with other psychiatric patients at various stages of recovery, individual sessions with a psychiatrist and psychologist specializing in schizophrenia, educational workshops about medication management and recognition of early relapse signs, and mainly structured activities designed to restore basic functional skills that might have been compromised during the acute psychotic episode. Julia, I'm beginning to understand through the therapies here that schizophrenia isn't moral shame or personal character failure, but rather a neurological medical condition affecting reality processing in the brain in a way I can't control through pure willpower, she told me during a particularly emotional visit in the second week of residential treatment. The therapist explained to me that just as a person with diabetes needs to take insulin for the rest of their life to manage a chronic physical condition, I'll need to take antipsychotic medication indefinitely to manage a chronic mental condition. And this doesn't make me less valuable or capable as a human being. Her words demonstrated the crucial beginning of psychological acceptance about the diagnosis she had initially rejected with absolute horror. The decision about when to allow Margaret to be discharged from the residential facility and return home was made after exactly 17 days of intensive treatment when the therapeutic team conducted a final comprehensive evaluation and determined she had achieved sufficient mental stability to safely transition to continuing outpatient care while living independently in the community. Dr. Henry called me for a final meeting where he explained in detail the post-discharge care plan that had been meticulously developed to maximize Margaret's chances of maintaining stability and minimizing risk of psychotic relapse in the critical following months. Mrs. Margaret demonstrated remarkable progress during residential treatment, consistently adhering to medication regimen, actively participating in therapeutic sessions, and mainly developing realistic insight about her condition, which is a statistically strong predictor of positive long-term outcomes. He reported with a tone mixing professional satisfaction and appropriate caution about future challenges that would inevitably come. However, transition from the structured environment of the residential facility back to independent life in the community is a period of elevated risk for psychiatric decompensation, so we've established a robust follow-up plan including weekly psychiatric consultations during the first month, psychotherapy sessions twice weekly, monthly support group for people living with schizophrenia, and mainly a 24-hour crisis hotline available for use if relapse signs begin to emerge. The day I finally took Margaret home after almost 3 weeks of total hospitalization between the initial municipal hospital and subsequent residential facility was simultaneously cautious celebration and occasion, loaded with anxieties about the uncertain future we now face together. She was wearing clean clothes I had brought from her house days before, graying hair carefully combed and pulled back in an elegant bun that restored some of the personal dignity that had been compromised during initial crisis days, when she was sedated and disoriented in a standardized hospital gown. Julia, I can't adequately express how grateful I am that you stayed by my side during the most terrifying and vulnerable period of my entire adult life, she said as we slowly drove back through familiar city streets toward her house she hadn't seen in weeks. I know making the decision to authorize prolonged admission against my initially expressed wishes was extremely emotionally difficult for you. But now I understand through the perspective therapy provided that you were protecting my long-term health and safety rather than simply satisfying me in the short term. Her words of gratitude and recognition brought tears to my eyes that I needed to blink rapidly to maintain clear vision of the road while driving. The 6 months following Margaret's discharge from the residential psychiatric facility were a period of gradual adjustment and constant learning about how to navigate a new and permanently altered reality of living, with late-onset schizophrenia requiring careful medical management and continuous vigilance for potential relapse signs. Margaret adhered impressively well to the daily risperidone medication regimen, despite uncomfortable side effects including moderate weight gain, occasional drowsiness, and mainly a sensation she described as emotional blunting, where her feelings seemed less intense and vivid than they had been before starting antipsychotic medication. Julia, I know medication is absolutely necessary to prevent recurrence of terrifying psychotic episodes like the one I experienced, but I confess sometimes I miss the version of myself that existed before, needing to take powerful psychiatric drugs that fundamentally alter how my brain processes emotions and experiences. She honestly admitted during one of our regular weekly conversations we established as a way to maintain close connection and allow me to monitor her mental state. But the therapist repeatedly reminded me the alternative to taking medication consistently would be risking recurrent psychotic episodes that could be progressively more serious and potentially result in permanent damage to cognitive functioning, so I choose to accept uncomfortable side effects in exchange for mental stability and ability to live independently. Paula, who had maintained characteristic emotional distance during most of Margaret's initial psychiatric crisis, surprisingly began engaging somewhat more after our mother was discharged and returned home. although her involvement was typically pragmatic and focused on practical aspects rather than intimate emotional support I naturally provided. Julia, I recognize you assumed disproportionate primary responsibility for caring for Mom during the crisis and subsequent months of stabilization, so I want to contribute financially to costs of medications and treatments not completely covered by the public health system, Paula offered during a phone call approximately 2 months after Margaret's discharge. Her offer of financial assistance was a form of support perfectly matching her personality oriented toward practical solutions, and I gratefully accepted, recognizing the accumulated costs of long-term psychiatric medications, supplementary private therapy sessions, and mainly time I dedicated to visits and monitoring represented significant investment of resources impacting my own personal financial stability. Approximately 8 months after the initial psychotic episode that had completely transformed the reality of our lives, Margaret had achieved an impressive level of functional stability, allowing her to resume many activities she had enjoyed before the crisis, while maintaining realistic awareness about the need for careful continuing management of her chronic mental condition. She regularly participated in a support group for people living with schizophrenia, where she shared experiences and coping strategies with others who understood the unique challenges of living with a stigmatized psychiatric condition, maintained consistent adherence to medication regimen, despite persistent side effects she had learned to tolerate as the necessary price of stability, and mainly had developed an open and honest relationship with me about her mental health that allowed us to work collaboratively to identify early signs of possible relapse before they developed into complete crisis. Julia, although I would never have wished to experience the terrifying psychotic episode that resulted in a schizophrenia diagnosis, paradoxically, the process of going through crisis, receiving intensive treatment, and learning to manage chronic condition taught me valuable lessons about human fragility and resilience. I wouldn't have learned otherwise. She reflected during a particularly deep conversation we had almost a year after the initial crisis. I learned mental health isn't a guaranteed permanent state, but rather something that needs to be actively cared for and protected. That asking for help during periods of vulnerability is strength, not weakness. And mainly that genuine family relationships are tested and defined, not during easy times, but rather during crises that force everyone to choose whether they'll remain present or distance themselves when the situation becomes difficult and uncomfortable. The experience of having compulsorily admitted Margaret during acute psychiatric crisis, navigated impossible decisions about prolonged treatment against her initially expressed will, and mainly supported her through challenging months of adjustment to the reality of living with a late-onset schizophrenia diagnosis, fundamentally transformed my understanding about mental health, family dynamics during serious medical crises, and mainly about my own capacity to remain present and committed even when situations became extremely difficult emotionally and logistically. I learned that true family love sometimes means making decisions the loved person initially resists, or even temporarily hates you for making, because you're prioritizing her long term well, being over everyone's short term emotional comfort. I learned the mental health system, despite all its failures and limitations, contains dedicated and compassionate professionals who genuinely want to help patients and families navigate devastating psychiatric crises. And mainly, I learned recovery from serious mental illness isn't a linear process with a defined endpoint, but rather a continuous journey requiring infinite patience, resilient hope, and mainly willingness to accept the loved person may never completely return to the version of herself that existed before the crisis, but can develop a new identity, integrating the experience of mental illness with persistent capabilities and strengths, defining her as a valuable and complete human being. Today, when I look at Margaret actively participating in her life with all the necessary adaptations and accommodations chronic psychiatric condition requires, I feel deep gratitude mixed with persistent sadness about lost innocence when we discovered brutally and suddenly that mental health we always considered guaranteed could in fact be fragmented by neurological processes we cannot control through pure determination or family love. But I also feel immense pride about the resilience we both demonstrated during an ordeal that tested absolutely every limit of our emotional capacities. The maternal relationship that survived and paradoxically even strengthened through a crisis that could easily have separated us permanently. And mainly the choices I made to remain present and committed, even when it would have been emotionally easier to distance myself as Paula and Richard chose to do for their own personal reasons I'll never judge, but that I know definitively weren't choices I could have lived with myself making. Do you like Julia and Margaret's story? Then subscribe to the channel. Leave your like and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you here on the screen. Click there and I'll be waiting for you.